A nurse begs the doctor to finalise his divorce with his wife before they can continue their relationship. Keller has burnt down his sofa-selling business and feigns innocence to the insurance brokers. A magician intent on entertaining his audience accidentally causes significant harm to his volunteer during the classic sawing off a body in half trick. And Lasser, a man who hasn't missed a day of work for 14 years, dedicating 30 years of his life to the business, is finally let go against his will. This is an urban world where nothing goes right, and the impact leaves its citizens in an apocalyptic listlessness. This is Roy Andersson's brilliant Songs from the Second Floor, a series of satiric and surreal vignettes, loosely connected to form an increasingly peculiar, yet oddly believable world, often visually bleak, grey and drab. Like many of Roy Andersson's great satiric films, Songs from the Second Floor provides scathing commentary on guilt, grief, and religion in a capitalist landscape which is increasingly more reminiscent of limbo, spiritual remorse, and divine punishment the further we delve into Andersson's world. While an undeniably dark film, Andersson always manages to make his scenarios hugely comedic. A volunteer who participates in a magic trick gone wrong stumbles into a doctor's clinic with a massive gash across his belly. Lasser is dragged across the floor, desperate to keep the job he was fired from, and a woman overhears her name spoken by a rambling homeless man who has just listened to her ex speak about being kicked out of their house. These are vignettes that sound depressing on paper, but Andersson's comic sensibilities make these moments just a few of the hysterical scenes present in the film. One of the most recognisable aspects of Songs from the Second Floor is Roy Andersson's inimitable style. The aesthetic of his film, and the films followed afterwards, is often grey, hyper-mundane and muted, a visual exaggeration of everything that makes an urban landscape unappealing. Andersson's prominent storytelling technique throughout the majority of his filmography relies on fixed camera angles, sometimes surprisingly turning ugly locations into beautifully immersive, painterly framing reminiscent of Edward Hopper's own artwork, and even artists from the Renaissance era, as they unravel brief vignettes, often loosely connected either by a single character, sometimes lingering in the background, or by a thematic idea. By doing this within Songs from the Second Floor, Andersson's film becomes an observant fusion of farce and tragedy, with a sharp eye for multiple details in the background which further enhances the satiric humour and the despair of the peculiar dystopia. Roy Andersson is a filmmaker who can find the infectious absurdity as well as the haunting nightmares of the everyday routine life. It wouldn't be wrong to consider his films antithetical to Jacques Tati. Discussing Roy Andersson's fascinating approach to storytelling, Roger Ebert had written in his review stating that Andersson is not telling a conventional story. He is planting his camera here and there in a city that has simply stopped working, has broken down, and is cannibalizing itself. Andersson sees it as an appropriate backdrop for the plague, or any other medieval visitation, and its citizens have fallen back on ancient fearful superstition to protect themselves. Consider the scene where clerics and businessmen, all robed for their offices, gather in a desolate landscape as a young woman walks the plank to her death below. Perhaps the sacrifice of her life will placate the gods who are angry with the corporation. We watch this scene and we are forced to admit that corporations are capable of such behaviour. That a tobacco company, for example, expects its customers to walk the plank every day. Roger Ebert's acknowledgement of the sardonic believability of a corporation, desperate to save its own hide, highlights the significant motif in Songs from the Second Floor, the listlessness of being left behind in a dying capitalist world. The dystopia in this film is failing to function, as things gradually become worse in increasingly amusing and often surprisingly disturbing ways. A corporation willing to sacrifice somebody to protect themselves feels believable when we currently live in a world where plenty of prominent businesses rely on union-busting tactics to strike subservience in their employees, or how corporations actively contribute to climate change or aid in the funding of war. At the centre of Songs from the Second Floor is a sense of capitalist guilt, grief, remorse. Job insecurity is prominent, such as when Keller burns down his own sofa-selling business. The reason is never fully elaborated on, but there are implications of poor mental health, or maybe even simple desperation for a change in career. Keller's eventual shift towards becoming a crucifix salesman for a stagnating business also reinforces capitalist job insecurity. This is not a role he keeps for long. Capitalist remorse also stirs within images of a procession of office workers flagellating the worker in front of them, possibly a sign of protest against their mundane line of work, but more likely a form of punishment for contributing to a system which degrades and devalues their efforts. This is similarly mirrored by the eternal traffic jam within the city, a signifier that everyone wants to get somewhere instantly, all at once, therefore creating never-ending congestion. As a woman begs for directions out of the traffic jam, it's clear that there's a sense of guilt imbued within the clogged roads themselves. Extending Roger Ebert's example of the sacrifice of a child to save a faltering corporation, there is capitalist remorse here too. Despite the approval of clergy, the perpetrators of this murder attempt to drink away their sorrows, unable to shift them, as if there's a momentary glimpse of reasoning that not everything for the corporation is good. In a brief moral sobriety, this serves as a resentful criticism of the superficial mentality of corporate managers who continue to exclaim that, in the workplace, we're all a family here. Clearly that isn't the case. For all of Roy Andersson's dry observations of capitalism, Songs from the Second Floor boasts clear religious iconography that creates another captivating layer to its dystopia. Is it that capitalism is a form of limbo? Images such as the continuous traffic jam, the whipping workers, Lasse's own lack of direction once he is fired from the job he fulfilled for 30 years, or even the seemingly thousands of people stuck in airport departures with their own modernist crosses to bear, heavy loads of materialist luggage, seems to suggest so. Additionally, during Kalle's time as a crucifix salesman, he is often plagued by spirits, many he doesn't know. Sven, a man Kalle owed money to, his debt only cleared once Sven took his own life, and a young Russian man left with unresolved tension towards his sister, both of them killed by the Nazis. The spirits locked in limbo follow him, likely with their only aim being to follow, similarly to how Kalle's own goal seems to be to follow others until he's left alone. The crucifix business bust, Kalle without direction, lost within listlessness again. Even Kalle's own son Thomas remains in a limbo-like state, a patient in a psychiatric hospital, remaining non-verbal, supposedly driven mad by writing poetry. Thomas shares the room with other patients speculating that Jesus wasn't the Son of God, but simply crucified for being a nice guy. Therefore, if Jesus is not the Son of God, then in Roy Andersson's world, Thomas becomes a Christ-like figure, a man chastised simply for the toll he's taken as a struggling artist in an increasingly monetized world. In Roy Andersson's dystopic satire, capitalism is the original sin, and to be without direction in a world full of faceless bland businesses and tiring family drama seems to be the ultimate divine punishment. Elaborating on his own views regarding Songs from the Second Floor, later in his review Roger Ebert wrote that, "Is there no hope in this devastation? A man who corners the market in crucifixes now bitterly tosses out his excess inventory. I staked everything on a loser," he complains. It is about the loss of hope, about the breakdown of all systems of hope. Its characters are piggish, ignorant, clueless salarymen who, without salaries, have no way to be men. The movie argues that in an economic collapse, our modern civilization would fall from us, and we would be left wandering our cities like the plague victims of old, seeking relief of drunkenness, superstition, sacrifice, sex and self-mockery. Songs from the Second Floor is a parade of fools marching blindly to their ruin, and for the moment we are still spectators and have not been required to join the march. When considering Lasse's firing, or Kalle once again being out of the job, and even the desperation of employees to save their own jobs by sacrificing a child, Roger Ebert's sentiment that these characters are often clueless salarymen who, without salaries, have no way to be men, is very apt. We see these characters after their failures, their loss of hope, their lack of direction, and we recognise that they are empty, with remorse and nowhere else to go. Amidst all the bleak imagery, there are traces of the cautionary, because while these may be foolish characters stumbling towards despair, Songs from the Second Floor could reflect our own fates if we become too comfortable in an ever-shifting landscape which places the importance of economics above basic humanity. In conclusion, Roy Andersson's Songs from the Second Floor sets the direction for the rest of Roy Andersson's career by finding the satiric within the surreal, yet somewhat believable scenarios that, through its small-scale glimpses into the cast of characters' lives, eventually forms a distinctive vision of a wider world, reflective of our own world's absurd priorities, placing economic value over basic human needs. For those new to Roy Andersson's filmmaking, Songs from the Second Floor is a great starting point. A special thank you to my incredible tier Patreon supporter Gil, and my super tier Patreon supporters Constantine Bombelli and Jamie.